Good afternoon, everybody, and welcome. I think you all know who I am. I'm Tom Miles. I'm Dean of the Law School. It's wonderful to welcome you to today's Ulysses S. and Marguerite S. Schwartz Lecture. The Schwartz Lecture was established in 1974 to bring to the law school distinguished lawyers with experience in the academy and practice, and especially in public service, to share their experiences and ideas with the law school and the university community. Judge Ulysses Schwartz was a longtime supporter of the university and the law school. He began his legal career as a special assistant prosecutor for Chicago in 1910, eventually serving on the Illinois Supreme Court until 1973. And after his death in 1974, a number of friends gathered to establish this lecture in his honor. And this lecture has brought many distinguished speakers to the law school since its creation. And we are thrilled today to add to their ranks Congresswoman Liz Cheney. Congresswoman Cheney is Wyoming's sole representative in the U.S. House. She was elected in 2016, re-elected in 2018 and 2020. From 2019 to 2021, she was chair of the House Republican Conference, which is the third-ranking Republican leadership position in the House. She sits on the House Armed Services Committee and serves as vice chair of the Select Committee to investigate the January 6th attack on the U.S. Capitol. Congresswoman Cheney is one of only 9 members of the House, 9 Republican members of the House, to vote to impeach President Donald Trump for his role in the attack on the Capitol. Congresswoman Cheney was one of Time Magazine's 100 most influential people in the world in 2021. She received the Profile in Courage Award. Before her election to Congress, she served as Deputy Assistant Secretary of State for the Middle East, and she practiced law at the firm of White & Case. Now, I'm biased, but I think her greatest achievement is that she's a graduate of the law school, member of the class of 1996. Congresswoman Cheney will engage in a conversation with our faculty colleague, Professor Geoffrey Stone, who needs no introduction. You know that he is the Edward H. Levy Distinguished Service Professor, an expert on constitutional law, especially the First Amendment. And like Congresswoman Cheney, he is a graduate of our law school. Please join me in welcoming Congresswoman Liz Cheney.
Thank you. Thank you. Thank you.
So just so you know, the format will be, we will have a conversation for about 20 minutes and then open up the floor for questions. So to begin with, what was your experience like when you were a student here at the law school?
Well, I've been speaking around the country at a number of places, as you can imagine, especially in the last year and a half. And I have to say I have not been as nervous as I am today.
We're not going to call on you.
But this is a very special place, and it's wonderful to be back. My experience was a little bit unusual at the law school because I had a baby. Our first daughter was born at the end of my first year. And so, of course, Chicago remains a very special place because of that. But I have to say, just the extent to which what I learned here, the challenges of being especially a 1L, I can feel you, everybody out there in the audience. But the extent to which both the training, the way to think about issues, the way to be prepared for arguments, the professors that I had here, I mean, it is such a special, special place and such an important part of so many things for me that happened later. And so I really am very, very touched and moved to be back.
What organizations, if any, were you involved in the law school when you were here?
One of the main activities I was engaged in was moot court. And we were just reminiscing backstage about moot court. I won moot court along with my classmate Ann Schumann. Mm-hmm. And it was interesting. One of the things that I have thought about a lot around January 6th is how many Chicago graduates have been involved. Most most for good.
Trump didn't go here, just
No, he did not. That's right. But it's really interesting if you sort of walk through the list. And one of my classmates was Noel Francisco, who of course went on to become the Solicitor General. And Noel represented former Attorney General Barr when the former Attorney General came in front of the Select Committee. And so I did think, I didn't say this, but I was thinking as I was watching Noel sitting there, well, you might have been Solicitor General, but I beat you in moot court. So.
When you were a student here, did you know that you wanted to go into politics?
I was more focused at that time on international work. And I also had the unusual experience. I graduated from college in 1988, and I went to work at USAID. And while I was there, the Berlin Wall came down. And so I had applied to Chicago and was accepted to come, I think, to begin in the fall of '89. But of course, that was when, the wall came down and there was so much happening at AID. And so I ended up deferring twice, maybe 3 times. I called in the Dean of Students, Dick Badger, and explained to him what I was doing and asked if I could defer. And he, each time I was granted the deferral. And so I'd had that experience and wanted to continue to work in international affairs. I remember being here and I wrote a paper for Professor Sunstein about why we need to abolish AID. And that was a real gripping paper, if you want. So I did not necessarily think about politics. And frankly, one of the things then, and I tell people this a lot, and I don't know if it helps her every time I say it, but one of my favorite professors here at Chicago was Elena Kagan. Mm-hmm. And she was my civil procedure professor. And one of the reasons that I enjoyed that class so much was because she kept politics out of the classroom. Of course, Professor Stone, you were one of my favorite professors too, as I sit here.
Of course.
Of course. The rigor of the education and the lack of politics in the classroom was so important.
So your parents were both very important people. Your dad was later to become vice president of the United States. Your mom was head of the National Endowment for the Humanities. To what extent did they affect your decisions to go into politics?
I think certainly because of, growing up around them, seeing what they did, obviously had a big impact. But I think that what I was watching my parents do, certainly when I was watching my dad's career, the things that I thought of as politics, as I look back, were really policy. And I think that's it's an important point, especially now, because our politics today, in too many instances, has completely lost the policy and the substance. And I keep a picture in my office. It's a picture of President Bush 41 and Brent Scowcroft and my dad, and they're in the Oval Office. And President Bush has got a book that he's reading. It's called Soviet Military Policy, like 1989. And my dad and General Scowcroft are briefing him. But I keep the picture there because it reminds me of serious people. And you could say, we disagreed with that policy or with that policy, but they were deeply engaged in the substance. And our politics and our country suffers when we lose that. And today, unfortunately, we are not, our politics have lost too much of the substance.
Speaking of family, your younger sister, Mary, is gay and married and has several children. And some years ago, you were pretty critical of gay marriage, but you later changed your mind about that. What caused that to happen?
I think my assessment or my sort of review of the issues around it really benefited from time, benefited from being able to recognize, I think, on the one hand, I think when you look at this issue from a constitutional perspective, you say, look, that's up to the states. But I think that certainly that there are some issues, and I think this is one of them, where people's right to marry who they want ought to be protected. And it's an issue for which my view has changed, and it's been, as you can imagine, a painful issue at times in my family. But my sister and I have, long ago discussed this, and we love each other very much.
I mean, the lesson I think one takes away from this is that it's really important to get to know people who have different lives, different experiences than oneself, in order to understand what the world is like for them. And on gay issues, it's become dramatically so. I mean, when I joined the faculty here, no student would admit that they were gay. And if they did, it would have been surprising, and to many people upsetting. And then over the years, as gay people have come out, the majority of Americans now accept that, and accept even the idea of same-sex marriage. And so I think for the audience, really, it's important, the lesson that you take away from that, or should, is that it's important to be open-minded, and it's important to listen to people who disagree with you and who have different values than you do, because you may learn that they, in fact, have experiences and perspectives and so on that you should be more open to.
Yeah, and I think that is true, on every issue, really. I mean, if I think about my experience on the Select Committee, and the extent to which we have Democrats and Republicans on that committee, and many of the Democrats on the committee are people that I don't know that I'd ever talked to. I certainly hadn't worked with before, but I think that there's an element of sort of the politics of this moment, and it's not just the politics of the moment, but it's the situation that we're in as a nation that requires everybody to do our very best to leave partisanship aside. And I feel like sometimes my job is really to stand up and to say, stop. I mean, and look, when I was the chairwoman of the House Republican Conference, one of the responsibilities of that person is messaging. And so you're responsible for talking points. You're responsible for making sure that the members of the conference have materials that they need to make the arguments about the issues you're dealing with. And it's a reminder that it can become very easy in Congress, and I think beyond Congress, to just sort of say, well, what are the talking points? This is the bill that's going to be on the floor. What are my talking points? And both sides do it, and it does a disservice to our politics. And having been through what we went through in the 2020 election, having been through a president who was willing to go to war with the courts, to ignore the rulings of the courts, a very clear and direct example of violence that can be sparked by incitement, by words that frankly, convey things that aren't true to people. I just think that, nobody is perfect. We've all engaged in attacks that, and I say, yes, I've certainly engaged in partisan attacks that I wish I hadn't. People have engaged in partisan attacks against me, against my dad, so it's not a one-way street, but we are in a situation as a country where it's really important, I think, for us to reflect about what's best for the country and how do we do justice to the positions that we're in.
So you mentioned the Select Committee. What's your takeaway from all this, and what impact do you think it'll have?
Well, there are many, as you can imagine. I think one of the most important ones is that behavior that's tolerated becomes accepted, becomes acceptable, becomes legal. And I think that when the history of this time is written, when you look back at what could have been, certainly there will be people who go back, obviously, to 2016 and say he never should have been president. to 2020 and say, that outcome should have been even clearer than it was. But I think that if you look at what we're dealing with today, one of the areas where that hasn't gotten that much attention is the damage that's been done because the Senate did not immediately try him. We immediately impeached him in the House, and then the article of impeachment stayed in the House. It didn't go to the Senate for a number of reasons. But the Senate ended up not having the trial until after he was out of office. And so there was a constitutional argument, which I think is wrong, that somehow you couldn't convict him because he was already out of office. And that gave people an out. And so you had Mitch McConnell, for example, give a very important speech about what Donald Trump had done, but say, look, it's not impeachable, we can't convict him now, and that the courts will handle it. But what you see is, a lack of responsibility at each step of the way. But the thing that gives me hope, and I think that's especially important talking to young people, is how few people it took to save us from a far worse constitutional crisis. And, if you think about the people who did their duty and who, Rusty Bowers in Arizona, who said, I am not going to do what Rudy Giuliani and Donald Trump are asking me to do, and Brad Raffensperger in Georgia, Cassidy Hutchinson and Sarah Matthews, people who stood up and who have stood up since then, and of course the Capitol Police who fought that day. And if anybody tells you that it was not violent or, as one of my colleagues said, it was just another normal tourist day, I mean, it's a lie. It's a disgusting lie. But it was individuals who made the difference. And I think that gives me hope. And I think it's one of the most important things for young people to take away, that, we have a duty and an obligation to make a difference, and you can. And at the end of the day, our system's fragile, but it's because of the goodwill of American citizens doing their duty that the institution's held.
So you obviously demonstrated extraordinary courage in taking the position that you did about the election and about President Trump and so on. Why do you think so few Republicans actually followed that example, given that you understandably are confident that the position you took was the right one? Why do you think so many of them didn't? Didn't they care about our country or democracy?
I think this is another area where, historians are going to ask that question for a long time to come. I think clearly one of the things that happened was, we all read history. Most of us do, I hope. And I think people tell themselves that, if they were in a position to do the right thing, they certainly would. But what we see is that it becomes very easy for people to sort of say, well, no, actually, this isn't that big of a crisis. I don't have to stick my head out. I can just keep going along, or to say it's much better if I just get reelected. But what happens is it becomes a cycle where, once you've said January 6th wasn't that big a deal, then it's very difficult ever to walk away from that position, and of course we had people who said and still say, well, it was a horrific thing, but we should just ignore Donald Trump and he'll go away. And I think obviously that's not the case. So I don't know the answer. Human nature maybe, but I think that really ought to guide people as you think about how you're all going to vote, for example, in every election. You ought to vote for people that you have the most confidence will do their duty and will do what's right, whatever the party is.
I have one last question, and if you want to ask questions, there are microphones back there. You should go and line up so you'll be able to do so, and don't be shy. Oh, they'll be walking around. I'm sorry. So if you want to ask a question, then just raise your hand after this last exchange. So simple question is, what's next for you?
I don't know the answer to that. The select committee will wrap up its work at the end of the Congress, and so I'll be working on that through January 3rd, and then make some decisions about what's next. I think that the results of this midterm election give me real hope. I think that the country is still in a dangerous moment, but I think what you saw was, and not in every race, because there were people elected who seem crazy, but in a lot of important races, those candidates didn't prevail. But I think there's a huge amount of work to do, especially with young people, talking about the Constitution, about the rule of law. I mean, we've talked about this moment on the House floor shortly after January 6th, where Lauren Boebert, who I hope soon we can refer to as former Representative Lauren Boebert, but where Lauren Boebert was giving a speech on the floor of the House, and she said, "We do not have to let the courts tell us what to do." And I listened to it and I thought, well, we do, actually, we do. And you're in Congress. If you want to change the law, that's what Congress does. We make law, and you can attempt to do it, but we listen to the courts. We follow the rulings of the courts. And so I do think that there's an element of making sure that I'm helping to elect people who are sensible and serious and responsible, and also talking about the Constitution. So that's a really vague answer, I know. Sorry.
You going to run for president? You don't have to answer that.
This is like Socratic method.
So if you have questions, raise your hand, and people come over to you with the microphones. One over here, over there. Okay.
Good afternoon. I would like to ask, how do you find common ground with people from opposite sides of the aisle without compromising the interests of marginalized communities, especially if people on the opposite aisle have sort of extreme views? How do you compromise without sort of like sabotaging people's interests who don't have a lot of political power?
Yeah, it's a very important question. I think about the extent to which people have to decide sort of what are the principles on which you will not compromise, and understand, though, that there are things outside of that on which you will and on which you have to. And I think part of it goes back to what Professor Stone was saying about when you sit down and talk with people and learn from them. Now, look, there are some people that, Marjorie Taylor Greene, there's some people that espouse views that have no place in our politics and have no place in our society. And those are anti-Semitism, white supremacy, racist views. When you have members of Congress who've attended white nationalist events, they ought to be off of committees. They ought to be condemned. There are some views that should never be inside the political tent. But there are a far larger number of people who, in this election, I endorsed two Democrats. I'm a Republican. I endorsed two Democratic members of Congress. And I don't think that I've ever voted for a Democrat. And I've been voting a long time. But I endorsed these two women because I served with them, one on the Armed Services Committee. I know them. I know that they are responsible people who care about our country, and who I can say to them, hey, I don't agree with you on these issues, but let's talk about where we can come to agreement over here. And I also know they're really tough, and they make me better, because if I disagree with them, they're going to be prepared, so I better come prepared. And that's what's good for the country. So I think recognizing and understanding that the vast majority of people in this nation are good and honorable and want to do what's right, and we have a tremendous amount to learn from each other, and that we ought to be able to do that in a way that's civil and that reflects the blessing that we have to live in this nation and to live in freedom. And I think that it's a simple thing, but it's harder to do than it sounds, and we need more people to do it.
Thank you for coming. So you've talked a bit about the historical perspective, and today we can all look back at Hitler's invasion of Poland and see that that is a war crime because it's an unjustified invasion of a country. Similarly, your father was instrumental in the invasion of Iraq that was unjustified and resulted in the deaths of hundreds of thousands of people. So, today, will you denounce your father as a war criminal and waterboarding as a war crime?
No, I won't. I appreciate the question. And I think this is a perfect example of, where we ought to be able to have discussion and debate. And, my view on those issues is clearly different than yours. And I think that it is important for us to debate things like what is America's role in the world. I think when you go back and you look at the period of time from, first of all, what America did during World War II, and the extent to which without America, without our involvement, Hitler would have won. And then what America has done since the end of the war until today to ensure that the world is one where the rules of the global world order are set by people who believe in freedom. And one of the things that I worry about, that I see too much of now, is isolationism in both parties, and a sense that America can pull back and that we don't have to lead in the world, and that we should pull back. And I think it's important to recognize that if America does pull back, then what fills that void is not another nation that believes in the values of freedom that we do. It's the Chinese, it's the Russians, it's the Iranians. And we don't, if people who sort of say, well, we can pull back within our borders, I think you have to grapple with the fact that a world in which China sets the rules, in which America's not leading, is a global surveillance state. And so I think, issues around Iraq, issues around waterboarding. My view about waterboarding is that, it saved lives, and it saved American lives, and that we were very clear. There was nothing that the United States did to terrorists that we don't do to our own men and women in uniform who go through the SEER training, for example. But again, I think that those are debates and discussions we can have, and that we should have, but I won't do what you asked.
Hello.
Hi there.
Great. Thank you for coming to speak with us and being willing to answer our questions. I think a lot of us here are very interested in policy and are passionate about trying to change things in the future, but the path to get there seems a little obscure. And so I was wondering if you had any advice for how to get there.
Well, I guess you guys you've made a great start if you're here at the University of Chicago Law School. It's not as hard to get there as it seems, I would say. Coming out of Chicago in particular, the opportunities to be involved in public policy, the opportunities to practice law, obviously, if you decide you want to go to a firm. But I would say decide what you are passionate about and what you care about, and don't let people tell you that you can't do it. Don't let people get you off path or off track. And the other thing I think that young people today, that we do a disservice to young people today, is we've moved away in the teaching of history from teaching about individuals, men and women throughout history who made a difference. But if you study those individuals, if you study what has made a difference, it's always men and women, always, who care. and who are willing to fight for what they believe in. And it can be, and I see it in Congress, on issues that may not be sort of the ones that rise to like national media attention, but the individuals in Congress who are able to get done what they want to get done are the ones who educate themselves, care deeply about their issues, are able to bring other people around the issues in which they care about. And I think that there's just a myriad of ways to do that. If you want to be involved in politics, figure out the people that you want to work for. And look, if you look at the outcome of these elections on Tuesday, and I haven't seen the formal breakdown of numbers, but the thing that we always have heard about young people is that they'll be passionate and they'll work on issues, but they won't actually go vote. Well, you guys voted, and it made a huge difference. And so making sure people turn out to vote, I just, it matters so much. And so pick issues that you care about, find ways to get involved, do the work, use your time, your summers here at the law school to work on issues that matter to you and in internships or summer associate positions. Ask people who've done it. But I can tell you, it can seem like you can't sort of break through and like, the government is so big and how do I figure out how to have an influence? It's actually a lot more fragile than it seems, and a lot more crucial that we have people who really care about these issues be willing to get involved and stay committed to it no matter how hard it seems. Am I calling on people?
They have to have a microphone. So.
Okay.
Hi, thank you so much for joining us and giving us this talk. So my question is actually about two things that you said that seem to be in tension with one another. So on the one hand, you mentioned that it's important for America to sort of have this moral hegemony in the world, because if we don't, then countries like Russia and China might fill in the vacuum. But then you also said that, it's important, or maybe not important, but sometimes it's necessary to make hard foreign policy decisions like engage in torture because it means that, we can save American lives. And those two things seem like they're in tension to me, just because if we want to set an example for how the world should conduct itself, it seems like America should take the lead in not doing those things. And so when, leaders like Putin might criticize the US for their own human rights violations, it's harder for us to sort of push back and say, we can be the sort of moral authority in the world. So I'm just wondering how you reconcile those two things. Thank you.
Thank you. Well, first of all, I would say that it's very clear that the extent to which the United States used enhanced interrogation techniques was not torture. And I think it's important to be clear about our words and clear about the discussions we have. And there were a handful of individuals on which we used waterboarding, for example. And those led, in the case of Khalid Sheikh Mohammed, for example, to the mass amount of information that we actually knew at that point about Osama bin Laden and about protecting us against future attacks. And I think precision is really important when we talk about these things, because I think there's no way that you can responsibly argue moral equivalence. And one of the most offensive things that Donald Trump does, among many offensive things, is he argues moral equivalence. You listen to him talk about, for example, the Crown Prince of Saudi Arabia. He has said things like, well, the United States, we can be butchers too. He says, he talked about Putin and he said, well, our troops have done horrible things too. And I think that moral equivalence, it's important to be responsible and not fall into that. I think that also is the case when you're talking about what are the rules of the road internationally, and recognizing and being very clear about both. In this case, I think if you look at America's moral obligation as well as what's in our national security interest, they go hand in hand. And I believe our moral obligation is to defend freedom. We don't always get it right. We have certainly not always defended freedom, But I think we have a moral obligation to do so because we are the only nation in history that was founded on these ideals. Now, we aren't perfect. We certainly were not perfect at our founding. We are not perfect today, but aspiring to achieve the ideals of our founding documents is how we become more perfect. And we're founded on the notion that all men and women are created equal, and that we have liberty and that we have rights because we're human. Now, again, we aren't perfect. We have not always lived up to that. But if we believe that about us, then that gives us a moral responsibility to help those who are fighting for their freedom around the world. And that's why I believe, for example, that we have to be supporting Ukraine and that we have to make sure that Putin loses in Ukraine, because we cannot be a society, we cannot live in a world where what Vladimir Putin is doing today in Ukraine becomes acceptable. And so I think that also is required for our own national security interests. And again, I mean, we're human beings. As I said, our country doesn't always get it right. But I do know that American leadership is absolutely essential. It's absolutely essential because what happens, and frankly, you're seeing it today. If you watch carefully, you'll see when, for example, the way that we pulled out of Afghanistan, the fact that we pulled out of Afghanistan, in my view, and Donald Trump wanted to do it too, so this isn't just a criticism of President Biden, sent a message that you can't count on America, that we won't be there to support our allies. And that's a message that the Chinese are watching. They're figuring out, well, is America really going to defend Taiwan? Can we count on the United States? You know, the other thing that's happening today is that the Chinese government, as they talk to other governments in Asia, and you can track this in open sources, they are saying, look at what happened in America on January 6th. Look at what happened. America can't run elections. You know, America is a power on decline. So these other countries around China should be with us. Don't support the United States. Don't think the United States is going to be there for you. And using that in a way that I think they think is very effective to help to spread their view of the world, which again, is a very dangerous one. Yes.
Yeah, they don't have the microphone, so you can't.
Is this it? Oh, hello. Thank you for talking with us today. A question or a theme that I seen coming in your discussion seems to be about the depoliticalization of certain norms, ideas, topics. We're talking about what's in the tent and what shouldn't be in the tent, and we're talking about listening to the courts and not listening to the courts. An issue that's close to my heart, for example, is environmental law and environmental concerns that are hurting everyone, and is kind of a concern that shouldn't be so politicized. Using that as a touchstone, how do you think we effectively depoliticize certain issues, especially because I feel like a lot of people in my generation and in this room feel that like everything's up for politics. Like I think there's a difference between me and when I talk to my parents and people of older generations that they sort of think like, oh, well, politics does these sorts of things and it doesn't do these sorts of things. And yet now it seems like everything's politics. How do we pull back from that?
I think I would say, first of all, politics isn't bad. And by that I mean, look, fundamentally, in a system that is a republic, if you want to have your voice heard, you engage in politics. So I think recognizing and understanding what it means to be in a participatory democracy is always going to involve politics. What's bad, in my view, is reflexive partisanship or reflexive sort of determining, well, I'm going to be against that issue because Republicans are always against it, or I'm going to be for this because Democrats are always for this. And I think that there's no way to avoid, I mean, I don't want to be Pollyanna-ish here, there's no way to avoid the politicization of some big issues. But there's also a lot of room to have discussions about the substance of those issues. And the incentives that go along with making sure you're voting for people who are going to engage in substance and not electing people who won't. And I think, you know, again, both sides engage in that. But I think there are several things that I think we have to guard against. First of all, when I say there are some views that should not be inside any tent, you know, the perspectives of sort of what we see happening on campuses too often with respect to cancel culture is a real thing and is a real problem. And so I think when I say there are views that shouldn't be in the tent, I'm talking about anti-Semitism and racism and bigotry. And I think we have to be able to draw that line. But I think that in the vast majority of the time, we need to be able to listen to each other and not engage in what has become very easy because of social media primarily, the kind of personal toxic attacks, but engage on the issues and realize I might not agree with you on environmental policy. Maybe I do. But let's talk specifically about what you think should be done, what I think should be done. One of the pieces that I think is very important, especially as you're, you know, thinking about sort of the law and what kind of law you want to practice, what are the real impacts on the ground for people of environmental regulations, of any kind of regulations? You know, it's one thing to sort of say, all right, these are the regulations that we want to see in place because we want to accomplish X, Y, and Z. And those regulations take on a very different feel when you're actually standing on a ranch in Wyoming and or, you know, standing in an area that's been reclaimed after coal mining and realizing that regulations created by somebody 2,000 miles away often have exactly the opposite impact on the ground that people thought they would. And I think part of that is coming back to facts and truth. And that's also become very difficult to have agreements about, you know, what is the truth. But for people to not accept living in a post-truth world where we walk away from facts, but commit to engaging in debates based upon them. I keep trying to call on you.
Yeah.
Yeah. What do you think about the two-party system, and do you envision any alternatives in this country?
I think that the two-party system is a very important one. I think it has been important. I think that we have to have two strong parties, and the system works best if we have two parties that are based on substance. And if you can say to people, listen, I think you should be a Republican because we believe this, or you should be a Democrat because they believe this. But the fact that the Republicans didn't even have a platform in 2020, I think, you know, is a real indicator of the challenge that we face. So I think that we're at a moment where the plates are shifting. There are people talking about third parties that never would have before. You know, I tend to think that our system really does work with two parties. That's how we're set up. That's how we're structured. But, you know, speaking as somebody who knows the Republican Party well and has seen it certainly from the inside, we have a lot of work to do to get back to being a party of substance.
Over here.
Hi. Thank you for coming in today. I was just wondering how you or any Republican can rectify an allegiance to democracy and an opposition to figures like Donald Trump and opposition to anti-Semitism with continued support and allegiance of a Republican Party that is continually becoming more friendly with the alt-right, white supremacy, and fascist ideology?
Yeah, look, I think that the Republican Party is in a very bad place, and my view has been that I believe in the values on which our party was founded. That I believe in things like limited government and a strong national defense. That those are the values of our party, and I've been a member of this party. I hate to see this party taken away, hijacked by people who believe the things that you have mentioned. I do think it's very, the party is very sick right now. And, if you look just at the example of Representative Steve King, who said some things that were, basically espousing white nationalism. And when he did, I think this was probably the early 2019, I was in Republican leadership then. We moved immediately. We stripped him of his committee assignments, and he lost his next race. If you fast forward then to, where we are today, and you look at how, you've got members of Congress who've attended Nick Fuentes white nationalist events and have faced no consequences for that. And I think that tells you that there's a very serious and severe problem. I would also say, though, that on the Democratic side, in 2017 or 2018, Ilhan Omar made remarks that were clearly anti-Semitic, and we moved a resolution on the floor to condemn her, and the Democratic leadership wouldn't allow the resolution to specifically name her or to condemn the remarks that she made. And so I think on the issue of anti-Semitism, without regard to party, we have to be very aware of the danger of rising anti-Semitism, the danger that it can lead to violence, and stand against that regardless of party. I don't know if the Republican Party can fix itself. I don't know how we come back. I think it will take several election cycles if we can, but it's a very challenging and it's a moment that we haven't seen before in history in terms of what's happened to our party today.
Hello.
Hi.
So part of the reason the Republican Party is sick is because millions of Republicans have sort of voted for it to be this way. And I think a lot of us have been pretty disappointed to see friends and family and neighbors so enthusiastically jump aboard this sort of diseased version of the Republican Party. So I was sort of curious what concrete steps you see to maybe help quell that aspect of the tide, to convince people to come back towards a more reasonable vision of the right in America.
Yeah, I think that clearly what we have seen, and I think there are a lot of different factors that go into this, but I think we've obviously seen Donald Trump spread disinformation and betray people. And I think we can't sort of say that there's one description for what ails my party. I think you have millions of people who are good, hardworking Americans who truly believe in this country, who have been betrayed by Donald Trump. And one of the things we talked about in one of the select committee hearings was the extent to which Donald Trump he took people's patriotism and he turned it into a weapon. And he actually turned it into a weapon and he launched it against the United States Capitol. And I think that it's very important to recognize that people have been lied to. I think certainly you have people who are consciously spreading the lie, who have made a decision that they're going to embrace the former president. I think again what you saw on Tuesday shows you though that the tolerance for that is not as high as I thought, and that's a really good thing. That people did reject a number of the candidates who were sort of the most aggressive in embracing those views. But in my view, what the Republican Party needs to do, and what we have needed to do certainly since January 6th, was say, absolutely not. This is a line that cannot be crossed. You cannot attempt to overturn an election and stop the peaceful transfer of power. The Republican Party, condemns that, walks away from Donald Trump, and ensures we do everything we can to hold him accountable for what he did, to make sure it never happens again. And we also are presenting to the American people our views of the policies that we think are the right ones for the country. Now, what happened was, Kevin McCarthy decided to go to Mar-a-Lago and bring Donald Trump back into the fold before January was even over in 2021. And so rather than reject him, we've been in this situation of, in some instances, increased embrace and lies about and whitewash about what happened that day. But I think those two things have to go hand in hand, being very clear about, there's a line that can't be crossed, and also being able to say, but look, here's what we believe. We think that the government spending that we've seen is contributing to inflation, and that the economic growth can't sustain that. We believe in a strong national defense, and as Republicans, we believe that the United States ought to be energy independent. I mean, I think we need to lay out what we believe so that people can make a choice, and people shouldn't have to choose, insurrection in order to say we want to vote for those policies.
Hi, my name is Natalia. Nice to meet you, and thanks for coming today. My question is, what issue are you most passionate about that's in contention with the Democrats?
Where to begin? No. It really differs. I mean, the issue that I've spent the most of my time on professionally is national security. I'm on the Armed Services Committee, and I also don't want to sort of stereotype all Democrats, but when I look at what's necessary to keep our nation safe, when I look at the advances that are being made by the Chinese, for example, by the Russians as well, when I look at the extent to which, I have probably the biggest disagreements with those, and again, it's in both parties now, but it tends to probably be more Democrats, those who suggest that if the United States were to disarm, that somehow our adversaries would follow suit, that the United States is the problem. And I think that we have lost a lot in terms of sort of strategic thinking around issues having to do with deterrence policy, and how do we actually deter a foreign adversary from the use of nuclear weapons, for example. We have debates in the Armed Services Committee about whether we should cut our strategic forces, our nuclear forces, and whether doing so would somehow lead to other nations, to adversaries, to cut theirs. I think that's not accurate. I think that I have a fundamental belief, aside from sort of the national security set of issues, in the role of government in our lives. And I think that government ought to be constrained by the sort of constitutional structure federal government should be, and that government that's closest to us is best. It's a lot better if you can walk down the street with a concern or a complaint that you have and have your views heard, rather than think that you've got to try to convince bureaucrats in Washington who may not be elected, usually aren't elected. And so I think those issues. I remember when Obamacare first was being proposed, and some of you may remember this, the Obama administration had, and by the way, Barack Obama was a professor here when I was here, so it's another interesting historical fact. But the Obama administration did a presentation, I think it was called The Life of Julia. And they had a woman, and they showed how Obamacare, the ACA, would provide for her at each stage of her life. And I think it's such an interesting example of, in some ways, how Republicans and Democrats view things differently. because I think most Republicans looked at that, and I did, and certainly thought, wait, why are we telling people they should be dependent on government at each stage of their life? Like that, we don't want people to be dependent on government. If you have to have a social safety net, but we shouldn't be increasing dependence on government. And I think people who supported the ACA thought, no, this is important. We want to see that the government is there at each step of the way. And so I think there is a fundamental tension about how giving the government enough power so that it is, basically intervening in every aspect of your life means you're giving up freedom. And I believe that, the kind of economic growth that we need in this country to prosper and to be secure, the kind of national security and defense policy that we need, those are areas where there probably are the most tensions. But I also think, as I said, in a lot of those areas, we're seeing strange alliances between people on the far left and people on the far right. And the policies are no better just because you've got people on the fringe in both parties supporting them. Thank you. People just can be loud. They don't have a microphone.
Sorry.
Thank you. What you did in response to January 6th was really courageous in using your position of power. And unfortunately, in reaction to that, you were stripped of that power. How has that changed your outlook at all on the ability of those on the inside to effectuate change? And what advice do you have to Republicans who might agree with you in your party to stand up for what we believe is like values of democracy when they see what happened to you in response to what you did?
Well, I think that the most important thing is for everybody, but especially people who are in elective office, to realize that nobody can be a bystander. So, the argument somehow, and I certainly hear it and I heard it, well, gosh, we'd like to be with you, but, it's just it's too difficult. It has an impact. And when you have, and I mentioned both Leader McCarthy and Leader McConnell, who took different views. McCarthy completely has embraced Trump. McConnell is hoping he'll go away. But the problem is that when you have so many elected Republicans refusing to stand up, then voters often will rightfully say, well, look, if it's really so dangerous, why are you the only one? Why aren't there more? And that's where responsibility comes into play for those elected officials. I was at a funeral for Mike Enzi, who was a senator from Wyoming, last year. And a number of senators, I had arrived at the funeral early in Gillette, Wyoming, and a number of senators came on a military flight from Washington. So they all came into the event center at the same time. And I was sitting in the front row. And I can't tell you how many of the Republicans came, and as they walked by me, would sort of lean over and say, "You go, girl. Like you keep fighting." And think about and I said, "Well, you could fight, But I think that's I guess the lesson for people, the message would be, you may think that you're keeping your head down and that things are going to be fine. But, this is the time when you're being tested, and history is going to record that you were tested. And we might not be able to keep this all together if you don't stand up. But I also think it's a matter of all of us as voters demanding that too. And realizing that people who may not have been engaged and involved in politics before, you just have to, whether that's run yourself or whether that's get involved as a precinct committee man or woman or the school board, you just have to. And I really don't care if you agree with me or you don't agree with me, get involved, because we have to have quality people who care about the issues, who are going to make a difference. And if we don't, we're going to leave this to people who don't really believe in the democracy. And that's not an imaginable thing.
We only have a couple more minutes left. Any closing statements you'd like to make?
Well, thank you. I feel like I got in and got out. I was scared. There was like mention of my moot court brief being discussed. But just thank you so much for having me. It's wonderful to be back. Thank you all for your questions. And my one message is get involved. And I will tell you a story that that I often tell, and it applies to men and women, but I tell it in the context of women because I have people come and ask me about running for office, as a number of you have. And it happens more than it should that when women come to see me, they come with a list of all the things they don't know how to do. And they come and they say, well, I want to run for office, but I've made this list. I've never fundraised. I've never been on television. I've never gone door to door. They analyze what they don't know how to do. And so the first thing is the men never do that. And so the message to the women is the men have no idea what they're doing either. So don't think that, that they do. But the second point is just dive in. When you think about, what we demand from people that we're working for, or from people we're hiring, or from people that, we have friendships with, there are pretty basic things that you demand of decency and honesty, people you work with, responsibility and seriousness. And we need candidates to run for office because too often right now there's not a good choice. Too often right now there's not a competent person to choose. And the country faces really big challenges. And we need people to recognize and understand the value and the importance and the worth of public service and of seeking elective office, because we can't meet those challenges if we have people who aren't up to the task. So I really hope that many of you in this room will consider public service, will consider running for office. I'd be happy to give advice and suggestions and guidance. Endorse your opponent if that would help. Endorse you. But please do consider it, and just thank you very much. It's really wonderful to be back.
Thank you. This was amazing.
Thank you. Thank you very much. It's great.
Really amazing.
Thank you. Thank you. Thank you. That was wonderful. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Congresswoman Cheney. We have a small gift for you, and what I will do is it's impolite to tell you before you open it what the gift is, but I will tell you what it is.
Okay.
In your opening remarks, you mentioned having your daughter when you were a 1L, and there's a photograph that we found in our archives of you and your daughter at graduation day out by the fountain. Congratulations.
Oh, thank you. Everybody's going to watch me open it now. Wow. Yeah, it is nice. Oh, wow. Aw, I love it. It's very 1996. Thank you. Thank you very much. Thank you.